Welcome, Alex. Welcome back, everyone. As you know, I'm one of the volunteers of Best Alumni Network, which is the organization that gathers all of the alumni of the organization Best. And today we have one of our alumni, Alex, who will talk about how to choose your first serious bike. He's an expert. He's an Ironman, so he knows quite some stuff about triathlon. So do ask your questions in the live chat if you are following the live. And Alex, what else about yourself?
Thanks, Clelia, for the introduction. And so to just give a bit of understanding about who I am and why I'm talking about cycling. So I've actually started triathlon 8 years ago, and you might ask yourself, what is triathlon? So triathlon is actually made up of 3 different sports: swimming, cycling, and running. It's always in the same order. It can be different distances, so it can be obviously short, can be long distance, but it's always in this order. And Ironman, Clelia mentioned, it's actually one of the longest distance of triathlon, so it's just one of the different types of, in terms of distances again. And cycling, usually within triathlon, it's one of the most, if probably the longest discipline, just because of the way triathlons have been set up. So now I'm actually talking about how to choose your first bike, and obviously we will get also to the point where we will discuss about choosing a bike for your first triathlon, for example, but we will actually talk about how you choose your first serious bike in general. So let's assume that you like cycling, that you know how to ride a bike, and you probably have been using like a very simple bike. Maybe you have been stealing your mom's or your grandma's bike, and you just use it to go shopping, for example, or to go for very, very short period of time from A to B. So now we will see how to choose your first serious bike. So let's actually start from the beginning. So your first serious bike is actually your first serious love.
Are you sharing your screen, Alex? Sorry.
Yeah, apologies. Sorry. Yeah. Let me do it immediately. Apologies for this glitch. Here we go.
Yeah, I can see.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Excellent. Great. Apologies for that. So your first bike is going to be your first serious love. As you can see from this slide, your first serious love can be in any form of shape. You might have an idea of what your first love could be, but generally speaking, there are several types of bikes, and all of them can be serious. Again, it's gonna depend a lot on your goal. It's gonna depend on your budget. It's going to depend also on a few personal things like where you live, your age, your personal situation, if you've got family, if you're alone, and your working habits. So let's actually look at some examples of bikes. So in this slide, you can see actually, I would say, a classical road bike, the one that you will probably see in the Tour de France or in the Giro d'Italia or in Vuelta de España. So it's one that you recognize because it has the classical competition shape with some disc brakes. The second one, starting from the left, the second one, it's more the type of bike that you could use, for instance, to go to the office, commuting. It could be, these days, it could be also electrical. So you can appreciate that, for example, in the middle of the frame, you can see that there is like a large battery, which again indicates that it's an electric bike. The third one in this picture, it's an example of a mountain bike. And the mountain bike is probably an example of a bike that most people are familiar with, or at least when I was a kid, for example, my first bike was actually a mountain bike. And the fact that it's one of the most popular, it's probably because the tires are actually quite big and fat, and therefore can be used on different types of terrains. And the fourth one is actually another example of road bike, slightly more suited for like long distance. So it could be actually classified as a gravel bike. So what's the difference, for example, between the first one on the left and the first one on the right? It's the fact that the first one would be typically used in races, and you can also tell from the fact that the wheels are wide and deep. They're called deep wheels because you can see that there is like a section where they try to actually exploit the aerodynamics to make you go faster. And the one on the right instead has got like some fat tires, again, a little bit more similar to the mountain bike. And it's more suitable, again, if you are, for instance, riding on gravel surfaces where it's not perfectly paved, and you might actually go long distance. So you could use it to move, for example, from one city to another city across different days. So in a nutshell, your first serious love can have different shapes, different forms. It depends a lot on your goal. So the first step, I would actually think about what you're going to use the bike for, mostly. Obviously, the bike can be used for different reasons. One day you can actually use it to visit your friend. One day you can use it to go shopping. One day you can use it to go to the office. But you just need to think about what and where I'm going to use my bike most of the time for. So it can be, obviously, most people will actually start using a bike as a hobby, but they would also think about using the bike to become fitter, to become a little bit more healthy. So these pictures are obviously just fun examples of how you can actually use the bike to keep yourself fit. Even during these challenging circumstances like COVID-19, you can use the bike even indoor. And you can see some example of even myself and my partner using a video game called Swift, where you can actually cycle without moving. So you are basically cycling indoors, which to some people might actually sound weird, but it can be quite fun. And again, for us especially, it has proven to be quite a good way to keep ourselves sane and to actually keep up with our hobbies. So we couldn't obviously ride outside, and we've been riding inside a lot. Provided that you've got the right equipment, you've got some fans also to cool yourself down. You can see obviously lots of water or lots of bananas in these pictures to keep yourself hydrated and refuel. You can actually keep going for quite a long time, believe me. And again, it might sound a bit boring, or it might sound actually strange, because again, you often associate the fact that you use the bike outdoors, but it's just not to underestimate the fact that you can use the bike in multiple occasions in different scenarios that you have never been thinking of. So another example of how you can use your bike is obviously traveling. And when I say traveling, I actually refer to the fact that using your bike, it's effectively a means of transportation. So you can go from A to B. Now, from A to B can be from, again, your home to the supermarket. So that's actually how your mom, for example, your father, or your grandparents can actually use your bike, the bike for. And that's actually another very useful use of a bike. But for many people, including myself, the bike has been like a way of, again, traveling. And when I say travel, again, it can be from one city to another. So for example, in the central photo, you can see 2 years ago, I actually traveled from London to Paris with my partner over 3 days. We did 500 kilometers, and it was a real adventure. We had lots of fun. It was challenging, surely, physically, mentally. The weather at times was great, at times it was not. And guess where it was great and where it was not. But generally speaking, it's a very fun way to just spend time with, again, your partner, with your friends. Or if or even like it could be like a way to discover another city on a budget. So you can see again some other example in these other pictures where in the picture right on the top on the left, it's a mountain bike which I rented in Cyprus, and they use it to go around the island. Again, was it a very effective way? For me, it was, because there were definitely places in Cyprus where I couldn't have access without a bike or without that type of bike, a mountain bike, because it was a bit rocky, the terrain was a bit difficult. So the bike again was a little bit more effective than walking or hiking. Obviously, I could cover a larger distance just using the bike. In the example on the bottom on the left, it's actually myself at Googleplex in San Francisco, and that was Google has got obviously a very large campus, and again it was a very effective way to discover about the campus in a quick short amount of time. So we had actually a friend that gave us a tour of the campus by bike using one of those proprietary Google bike. You can recognize it probably from the colors. And again, it was very effective. Now, another example on the bottom on the right, it's actually, again, a public bike that I used in France, where I basically went around the city, and I was just discovering I couldn't actually use my bike, and I couldn't use a public bike, so I just rented one. And again, for me, it was another example of a very effective and smart way to travel around. And the last but not least, you can see in the top picture on the right, my first love. That's actually my first serious bike, which I bought 8 years ago. A black and yellow Giant, which I used in that example to travel again from London to France, not to Paris. In that occasion, it was to Lille, another city. And that was again back in 2012. So it was a little bit less planned, a little bit more adventure. But again, I found myself wanting to visit a friend in France. And it was actually too late to buy a train ticket because at that time it was too expensive. And then I realized that, well, I have a bike. I know how to cycle, and I could use it. And again, it might sound crazy, and it probably is. But again, it's another example of another way, unexpected way of using a bike in an alternative way. And then we come to the last but not least example of how you can use a bike. You can, when you get addicted to cycling, and when you get addicted to triathlon, like in my case, you enjoy it so much that you end up racing on a bike. And typically to race on your first bike in a form of a cycling competition or triathlon competition, you can typically use two bikes, a road bike and a triathlon bike. You recognize the difference between a road bike from a triathlon specific bike, because in a triathlon bike, you see this kind of appendix, these bars that are mounted on the handlebar, which you can use actually to get yourself into a more aerodynamic position. So you try to actually bend your back, and you try to adopt this kind of horizontal position where you get less wind resistance. And that's just an effective way to gain speed and to travel faster. But again, this is a very specific use of a bike, and most people can be very competitive and can use it for racing, but you can also use it for like group rides with your friends. You can use it in club rides. If, for instance, you find yourself, like I did 8 years ago, moving to another country and trying to find like a new cycling club in a way to find also new friends. And that's what I did. And again, it's a hobby that has stayed with me since then. And it became so addictive that eventually I started racing on my bikes and tried to upgrade my bikes as well. So let's actually recap what would be my 5 top tips. So again, it's very important to decide what your goal is. So why are you buying a bike? Now, we talked about different ways of using a bike. We talked about several bikes, several different types of bikes. So it's very important that you think about your lifestyle, you think about where you live, and you think about, okay, why you want to buy a serious bike. Do you want to use it for touring, for example, like in the example we discussed about going from one country to another, or from one city to another? You want to use it as a means of getting fitter. So whether you use it indoors or outdoors, or you actually want to start doing triathlon because maybe you know already how to swim, you know already how to cycle, and you know how to run, and you want to actually give it a go in a short distance, maybe triathlon. I wouldn't suggest starting from long distance, obviously, but it's very important that initially, before buying a bike, you think about what your main goal would be. And then once you have decided what the main goal is, then obviously you can choose the right type for you. So obviously, if it's for racing purposes, you want to try your first triathlon race, or you want to actually try your first Gran Fondo, which is basically in our way of saying like a long distance cycling event, then you might want to choose a road bike or a triathlon bike. And you can see from the presentation that when I say triathlon, I also use the terminology time trial. So time trial is typically in events when you actually race against the clock. Time trial bikes and triathlon bikes are very similar. So it starts to be very technical because they are actually slightly different, but most of the time those two words are actually used interchangeably. And then you've got like the gravel or touring bike, which we discussed about going from, for example, from London to Paris, or discover about a city. We discussed about the mountain bike. If, for instance, you live in the middle of the nature and you've got like some wooden parks nearby where the terrain is quite rocky, then you might want to choose a mountain bike. Or again, you choose a mountain bike simply because you live in the mountains. And as the name suggests, the mountain bike is the perfect type for mountains, especially when you're going off-road. Again, most of the people associate the idea of having a mountain bike with going off-road. Whereas if you stay on road, on a paved where you share actually the road with the cars, most of the time, unless the road is not paved particularly well, but apart from those exceptions, then you might want to choose just a simple road bike. And if you live in the city, then you might want to find a compromise, which is a city bike. Again, we mentioned how the city bikes can be electrical, so, and sometimes even foldable, because maybe you cover a short distance with your city bike, and then you can fold it, jump on a train, and once you arrive at destination of your train journey, then use it again to get from the train station to the office. So again, depending on what your goal, your main goal would be, then it's very important to decide what is the right type. After you have decided what the goal and what the type of the bikes is, then you give yourself a budget. And it's very important that actually you stick to the budget, because it's very tempting when you enter a shop, a bike shop, or when you start Googling the bike of your dreams, then it's very tempting to go overboard and give yourself a budget. And you want obviously to have like a good budget, because you want to choose a quite serious bike, but you want to give yourself an upgrade so that you start enjoying it more, whether it's road cycling, whether it's cycling in the mountains, whether it's actually cycling more around the city, or going around from one country to another. Use it to discover more on your travels. But it's very important that you actually upgrade your bike, sticking to your budget. And then there is always time, for me also across the last 8 years, when I started also doing road cycling and triathlon, I started with my first serious love, but then I obviously upgraded. After a while, maybe a couple of years, you change the frame, you upgrade the wheels. You can do lots of small changes that can be over time. So you don't need to actually seriously commit to the bike of your dreams immediately, spending maybe $5,000 on your bike. Once you decide what the goal is and what the type, and you have given yourself a budget, it's very important that you understand what is the right fit, what is the right frame. So most of the time, this is actually quite a technical bit, and you want to actually ask your friends. You can also reach out to myself if you have any questions. I'm sure that we will have a Q&A at the end of this session where you can actually ask questions also about the fit. But in any case, you can always choose the closest bike shop. And it's important that you go to the bike shop having given yourself an initial goal and the type of bike that you're looking for with a budget. But then obviously an expert can recommend you the right bike and the right bike for you. Because again, let's not forget that we're all individuals with unique goals and a unique body as well. So it's very important that you choose the bike that actually fits your purpose, but fits your body as well. Because when you choose a bike, again, seriously, then you want to make sure that you can use it over a number of years, and you can use it possibly several times even several times a day, because maybe you can use it again to go to the office, but you can also use it to visit your friend. You can use it to actually go to a shop in a quick way. And especially in cities like London, for instance, where Clelia and I live, it's a very efficient way. For instance, I always find myself being quicker on the bike than using public transportation, because obviously going by bike, you can choose a quite straight line, and you also avoid those dead times about going from your place to the station or from the station to the office. So it's very effective way. And over time, you can also consider a bike like eventually a cost-saving solution. Because, for example, in my specific case, over the last 5-6 years, I've been cycling to the office every day. And therefore, as a result, I've obviously bought a bike, and I actually bought more than one bike. But I saved lots of money on the monthly transportation. For me, it has been also a way to even save money, even considering that, again, bike requires also maintenance, and there are also costs. It's not just buying the bike and forgetting about that. You need to actually care about your first serious love. It's not just that initial moment, but it can be also a way to save money. And then you, again, once you have decided what is the right type, and someone like in a bike shop or an expert friend has advised you what is the right fit and the right frame for you, then you need to buy also a number of accessories. So proper clothing, again, depending on where you live, and depending also on the season, you might want to choose like summer clothing or winter clothing, depending whether you live in a very warm climate or very cold. Cycling in winter or when it's rainy and cold is not obviously as enjoyable as it is during the summer or during sunny days. But there is not such a thing like cycling outdoors in the winter is not possible, because at the end of the day, if you have got the right clothing, if you buy some good clothing as well, it might be worth to actually spend a bit more, but to get something that can be, for instance, waterproof or windproof. And then even if, again, it's not particularly enjoyable, you can still ride your bike 365 days a year. So don't let rainy days or cold climates deter you from start being more serious about your cycling. And then shoes, again, depends very much on the type of bike that you have chosen. There are road cycling shoes, there are mountain bike shoes, or you might want just to use normal sneakers, normal like gym shoes. For instance, if you're using like a city bike, but depending again on what the goal and what the type of bike you have chosen, you might want to consider also shoes specifically for them. And again, we talked about like riding the bike in different conditions. So you definitely have to consider lights, proper helmet as well. Whether it's for racing purposes, you might want to choose, for instance, an aerodynamic helmet, or you might just choose like the sturdiest helmet that you come across because you're going to use it in the city. And one piece of advice that I will give you is that when it comes again to the helmet, don't think that, for example, if you're using the bike in the city and the distance you're covering is very short, you don't need a helmet. Because very, very often it's not actually depending on your speed, but it depends on the obstacles that you find on the way. And at the end of the day, you're sharing the road with other users. And not every single user is particularly careful. So in my experience, I've had also a fair share of accidents, and the helmet have saved my life. So I would definitely suggest a good helmet is not just an optional accessory, but is definitely a fundamental accessory. So when you choose the bike, don't forget that you need to choose also some good clothing, good helmet, possibly shoes, definitely lights if you want to also riding when it's dark, because I don't know, for example, you just visit a friend and you were thinking, okay, I'll be back home during the day, but then the chatting with your friend went over, and then you find yourself being stuck because you haven't got the lights to go back home. So again, think about possible scenarios where you can use the bike in different ways. And at the end of the day, I would always say, give yourself a budget for the bike, but give yourself a budget for the accessory as well. So if you've got like, let's say, £500 or €500, think about not spending that £500 or €500 everything on the bike, because then you need to consider also like some good clothing and some good accessories. So this is in a nutshell how I would advise about choosing your first serious bike.
Thank you, Alex. That was very interesting, and actually, we do have a few questions and comments. I will start
Excellent.
with mine, because you talk about understand what the right fit and frame is, and you said it's quite technical, but I guess it's about, I don't know, measures, how tall you are, how does it work, and how do you understand what's the right frame for you, for yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Clelia. This is a very good question, because obviously when you decide what the goal and what the type of bike you're looking for, this is something very personal that depends entirely on you. But when it comes to the right fit and frame, you have to actually ask for expert advice most of the times, because you want to make sure that, again, it's the bike that it's fitting you, and you don't suffer from back pain, or you start having problem with your knees, or any body ill that actually would prevent you from cycling further, and would actually kind of let you not enjoy cycling. So without being too technical, let me actually give you an example. I think I've got an example of a bike fit. This is actually a bike fit that I did back in London a couple of years ago. What is a bike fit? So there is an expert that actually looks at you, at your body, at your flexibility. In my case, for example, even if I'm serious about cycling, I'm not particularly flexible. And so an expert would actually take into account those kind of elements when suggesting about the right frame, the right size for you. So there are two main
Sorry, if
elements.
you can go full screen, or
Sure.
if possible.
Yeah.
I know it's not easy
So
because it's a PDF, but yeah, okay, thank you.
is it a little bit better?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So these obviously can be quite technical, but let's say that there are two main criteria. So when we're talking about a road bike, for example, this is actually one thing I want to make sure that it's clear. This is actually a bike fit for a road bike. So the bike fit also is very specific to the type of bike that you're buying. So in my case, I was looking to buy a road bike. So I was doing a bike fit for a road bike. Now, once it's clear that, again, the bike fit expert was looking at me and my flexibility, how tall I am, my weight, and a few different measures. But essentially, it comes down to two main elements. One is called the frame stack, and the second one is called the frame reach. So you can see those two elements here at the bottom of this report on the left. But essentially, the frame stack is basically the distance that covers between yourself, your chest, and the bottom of the pedals. So let's imagine that you've got the pedals in an horizontal position. So let's say at 3 and 9 of the clock, that distance between your center of gravity and the pedals is what defines the frame stack. The second one, the frame reach, it's a distance again from your center of gravity to the handlebars of the bike. So basically adjusting those two main elements in a bike frame allows you to choose what is the right bike for you. Most of the road bikes usually they go with the top tube size. So most of the road bikes they've got like for example 48 centimeters top tube frame, 51, 54, 56, 58 centimeters. And I would say that if you are slightly on the smaller scale, like myself, I'm 165 centimeters, possibly you want to choose a bike where the top tube is around 48, 50 centimeters. If you are like, let's say, more of a standard person, 175, 108 centimeters, then very possibly it's 54, 56 centimeters in the top tube of the bike. And if you tend to be on the taller scale, so maybe you are like 190 centimeters or above, you want to choose a road bike where the top tube is maybe 58 centimeters or 60 centimeters. But that's exactly why you go to a bike fit expert, because the bike fit expert would actually look at your body, would measure your insem. So the insem is exactly the length of your pelvis measured from the bottom, from the floor. So for example, what you can do, you can find actually many videos on YouTube. You can actually lean against the wall, and you stand in an erector position, and you put something, you close your legs, and you try to hold with the legs a book. And that book goes up just to the private area, where it starts to be almost uncomfortable, but not quite. So make sure that it goes all the way up, but without obviously causing any discomfort, any pain. And you try to actually see where the book stands on the wall, and measure that distance from the bottom of the floor to the book. So you've got an idea of what your insem is. It's not too dissimilar to the insem of a pair of jeans. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does. Well, it's very technical. Oh, actually, there's a question about the two basics. I think they were at the bottom left. One is frame stack, and the other one was the
so the stack, the
grip
reach.
angle.
So again,
I think was it the grip angle?
No,
The
it's
second one.
frame stack and frame reach.
Ah, okay, so stack, STACK, and reach is
Yes.
like
The reach is exactly, again,
REACH.
think about, for example, a spinning bike. Your instructor usually will try to look, just using their own experience, the reach of your arms between yourself and the handlebar. One advice is, for example, when you choose when again you actually ask for advice, the bike fit expert most probably will tell you that the arms, when you're riding the bike, shouldn't be completely straight and shouldn't be completely bent. They shouldn't form like a 90 degrees angle, but it's more like a 45 angle. Or I would say 135, depending of which angles you measure, but they should be slightly bent, definitely not bent all the way, and not straight either.
Yeah.
Because then it's very easy to suffer from back problems. Whereas when we're talking about the frame stack, again, it's from the center of gravity to the pedals. And again, the idea here is not too dissimilar. The leg shouldn't be straight, so it shouldn't be too uncomfortable to actually reach the pedals, but it shouldn't be that bent either. And again, 40, 50 degrees angle is probably the optimal. I would say even 30. So again, the bike fit expert will definitely be able to advise. But the legs, shouldn't be totally straight and shouldn't be bent either. Especially if you start covering long distance, you want to make sure that the bike is the right fit for you. And again, in some cases, you can adjust the saddle, you can adjust the handlebar, but in some cases, there are certain models of bikes that simply won't fit you because your body is built in a way that will definitely accept some sort of bikes or some sort of models. Because again, think about the road bike. Obviously, with the road bike, there are several brands, a bit like you have several brands for running shoes. And there will be brands that will make bikes that will perfectly fit you, and some of the brands that will have bikes that don't fit you. Because maybe let's take an example of a specific model. Let's actually use it. Canyon is a German, for example, brand that produces road bikes, and one of their models is called Ultimate. So, for example, I remember when I was talking to my bike fit expert, he advised that the Canyon Ultimate in the small size was actually not the right fit for me because it was good in terms of frame stack, but it was not good in terms of frame reach. And then if I had chosen the extra small of that model, it would have been the other way around. So the frame reach was good for my range, but the frame stack was not. So that simply meant that that model, my body was not the right fit. And then Canyon itself, this German brand, was producing another model where I actually could fit. So again, it's very important that when you choose your first serious bike, it's very important that you ask for some expert advice. Even if you think that you can do it yourself, yes, sure, for sure. I just gave you an example of how you can measure, for example, your insem. And you know that, for example, if you're buying a second-hand bike from someone as tall as you, there's a good chance that can fit you. But be careful because, for example, the same person is as tall as you, but it has maybe slightly different proportions. So maybe their upper body is slightly longer and they've got like shorter legs than you. So you can easily see also from the hip bone. If the hip bone is actually at the same height, then there is a good chance that when it comes, for example, to the frame stack, you have the same frame stack of someone else that can be even taller than you, can be shorter than you, but the length of your legs is exactly the same.
And once you get your first serious bike, where do you store it? Because if you use it for commuting, let's say, um, Yeah, you spend quite some money. You don't want to
Yeah.
leave it outside, or I don't know.
Yeah, that's actually part of the package. So again, when you give yourself a budget for your bike, don't forget that again, there is clothing, there are lights, there is a helmet, there are shoes, and possibly an insurance on top of that. So again, if you're spending maybe £100 or €100 on your bike, maybe it's not worth to actually buy an insurance. It might be worth to actually buy a specific lock, a good one. If instead you're going for more, for a slightly higher budget, and you're going for a kind of premium bike, then maybe it's worth to actually think about an insurance. So again, depending on the type of bike that you end up buying, then you might want to think about a good lock, a good bike lock, or you might even want to think about buying an insurance for your bike, so that even if it's stolen, then you are covered. And again, this is quite specific in the sense that it depends on your storage options. So if, for instance, where you live, you've got like a way to actually store your bike inside, then this is obviously the safest option. In my specific case, for example, I've got quite a few bikes, and some of them I actually store them inside at home, and some of them I store them outside with good locks. So even the bikes that I store them inside, I've got an insurance on top of that, because maybe it's my racing bike, and obviously I want to make sure that even if someone burglars into the house and steals the bike, then I'm covered. So again, depending on your goal, depending on your specific situation, if you can store it at home, but in any case, you probably want to buy a good lock anyway, because there is a very good chance that it's not always possible to leave it inside a home. Because if you visit a friend, then yeah, surely they can maybe store the bike inside for you. But if you are actually going to a shop, you cannot actually enter a supermarket or any other shop with your bike. So you have to leave your bike temporarily on the streets, and therefore you definitely need a good bike lock, and possibly an insurance if you want to be covered in the case they steal it.
Yeah. We also have a question about brakes. Do you suggest disc brakes? And if so, do you think it's useful to use them on any bike or just for some specific activities?
Is the question coming for a road bike or for a city bike?
It could be, I mean, activities, for example, mentioning specific activities. I see between brackets road, trial. So,
So for, again, disc brakes are actually becoming more and more popular. Disc brakes tend to be more effective when it's wet. They actually allow you to brake a little bit more effectively. They used to not to be popular, especially in races, because it's very easy to actually see crashes during cycling events, and disc brakes can be very, very, very dangerous. But now technology has evolved, and now you can see disc brakes even on road bikes and during cycling competition. So depending on your goal, you might want to think about getting a bike with disc brakes. You have to think again whether you would use it in almost every condition. So if it's a bike that would be used when it's wet, when it's rainy, then disc brakes can be very useful. If you tend to be more like on the recreational side, and you are serious obviously about your first bike, but you actually prefer to just enjoy it when it's sunny, to go out with friends, and then if it's a rainy day, maybe just forget, then disc brakes obviously are not as essential. Also because disc brakes actually require a bit of maintenance. So the wheels that actually go with disc brakes are quite specific. Are not the same. They're definitely not the same with brake pads. So if you've got brake pads, it's easier also to, for example, if you get a puncture, to replace the inner tube of a wheel, it's easy. It's easier, much easier, if you haven't got disc brakes. So again, depending on the use, on the conditions when you would use the bike, there are a few factors. So I appreciate that maybe it's not the right answer, but really it depends on the cases. Generally speaking, for road cycling, now it's quite accepted to actually more and more bikes have got disc brakes for competitions as well. But just be aware that, for example, for the city, or if you get a puncture, it can be just a little bit more, just a bit less intuitive. It's not rocket science. You can obviously learn very quickly, but it's just something to consider.
Your first serious bike, can it be second hand?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
My first serious love was secondhand.
Okay.
And I would definitely suggest that you don't need to actually buy a brand new bike, especially if you want to get a bit more value for your budget. Because obviously secondhand, if you know the source, if you trust the person that you are buying the bike from, there are so many examples of secondhand bikes in great conditions where you're saving money, but you're effectively getting a top bike. So I've bought in the last 8 years, I think 7 or 8 bikes, and only one was brand new. So all my other bikes have been secondhand. I was always trusting the person that I was buying the bike from. It was maybe a shop that was selling like previously a demo version, or someone, again, maybe a friend of a friend. So it was like a trusted source, as trusted as it could be. But definitely, your first serious bike can definitely be a second hand.
And still about second hand bikes, there is a specific question about carbon fiber. That's a particular material. So how risky is it that you can you can buy a second hand carbon racing bike that, for example, I don't know, is there a way to recognize a cracked carbon bike before buying it?
And no, you need an expert eye. So
Okay.
you need someone that is very expert in, even like it requires like a very careful analysis. So you need to inspect basically every inch of the frame and potentially detect any small crack and try to recognize whether it's actually the paint which has been chipped away, or there is like a proper dent in the frame. And especially if the material is carbon, so carbon is very light, it's durable, but it's also easier to break. And again, based on my own experience, carbon bikes are great, but depending again on your goal. So if it's racing, then you probably want to choose a carbon bike instead of an aluminum frame, because it's lighter. They tend to be more expensive, obviously, because they're lighter, but then it's also easier to get a crack. So you need to be very careful where you store it as well, how you handle the bike. And if you're buying a second-hand one, then you want to obviously inspect it properly. And what I did, for example, in my own experience, I actually went with a second-hand bike with the owner to a shop, and I agreed with the previous owner and I said, okay, I will ask this bike shop to actually get it inspected, and then I'll obviously pay the bike shop as well. And then if the bike shop confirms that there are no cracks, then I will definitely happily buy the bike from you. So that's a good compromise of like maybe buying a second-hand bike, making sure though that there are no cracks. Again, unless you totally trust the source, but even the source, even the person selling you can have like bad intention in selling you a frame that they know that there is a crack, or sometimes they're not aware. For example, I remember one on my previous bikes, I had a crack. I developed a very light crack, which I was not aware of until at some point the mechanic discovered it by chance. And again, when the crack is small, then you might ride with it maybe for thousands of kilometers and nothing really happens. But then you get like a bump on the road, and then that crack suddenly tears your bike apart. And if you're going downhill, there is a good chance that you are going to get into a serious crash. So is it worth the risk when you discover that there is a crack on your frame? Possibly not, very possibly not. Because especially if it's carbon, that crack can easily snap the frame at any point.
Understood. And about your goal, you said one of your 5 tips is to decide your initial goal, right? But it's hard to choose your initial goal. So, for example, someone said, I'm not sure I would buy more than one bike, because if I have more than one initial goal, then I should buy more than one serious bike initially. And so, is there a type of bike that you would advise for multi-purpose activities, multi-purpose use?
Yes. So a road bike, for example, even though most people would actually think about road bikes as very specific for competition, there are certain models of road bikes that can be quite versatile. So they can be flexible, can be used for example, for long distance riding, but they can be used also like in normal, let's say, circumstances, like going to visit a friend. So we talked about different type of bikes at the beginning of the presentation. Let me actually take it again. So in our first slide, for example, we saw like 4 different models, right? The first one was a road bike. The second one was like a city bike, electric one. The third one is a mountain bike. And the fourth one is a gravel bike. So almost all of them can be used in different scenarios. Now, I would say that, again, depending on what the main goal. So if the main goal is like cycling for 30, 50 kilometers a week, then maybe a road bike can be very enjoyable. And road bike can be used like when you want to go out with friends or with a cycling club, or you want to start thinking about your first triathlon, then a road bike is great. And that doesn't mean that you cannot use actually that road bike to visit a friend. Actually, I use my road bike to visit friends as well. Now, the city bike starts to be quite specific, because the city bike is great at riding around the city, but if you want to actually start cycling a bit more and maybe covering like long distance, then the city bike is not possibly very versatile, so it's not totally flexible. The mountain bike, is it flexible? The mountain bike tends to be flexible, but again, mountain bike requires actually physically a bit of energy to handle a mountain bike properly. So do you want to actually ride it along like 90 kilometers? It starts to be quite tough. So do you want to compete in your first triathlon with a mountain bike? Yeah, it's possible, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. And in the last example, the gravel example is actually possibly one of the most flexible, because you're effectively looking at the gravel bike and looking at the road bike, and they look very similar. The main difference is the tire, and having like fat tires means that you can actually adjust it and go off-road as well, like on gravel, not off-road like on the mountains. Mm-hmm. So there are certain type of bikes that are definitely more flexible than others, and you can use it for different purposes. But it's very important that you decide, okay, most of the time I'm going to use this bike for, and the result of that, again, if it's used mostly to enjoy cycling with friends, then a road bike can be good, and you can maybe just change the tires if you start going outdoors more than expected initially. City bike is a bit less flexible. It's perfect to ride around for short distances, and especially if it's electric, obviously it's also very quick. and it doesn't require much of your physical activity, physical energy. So again, do you want to get fitter? Then electrical bike is maybe not the best option, because it's an advantage, but it tends to actually take away the physical element of a bike. And then mountain bike again can be quite specific as well. But again, depending on your budget, maybe a mountain bike can be slightly cheaper than a road bike, especially a carbon frame. So it's a combination of goals, budget, and the proper way you live. If you live in a city, if you live in a suburban area, if you live in the mountains in the middle of nature, and the roads, also the road conditions, if where you live, there are some good roads or not. So that's also, for example, would I go for a road bike if the roads around my house are very bumpy and there are lots of cracks and potholes on the road? Maybe it's better to go for a gravel bike, because then having fat tires obviously helps you to reduce also all the shocks from the road, and also you tend to get less punctures if you've got like fat tires. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. I have one very last question that's again a bit technical maybe. It's how to choose a saddle, how to measure yourself bone distances.
So I actually talked about the bike fit analysis, and let me actually take it again. So we talked about frame stack and frame reach. Those are two important elements, the two probably main ones when you actually go for a proper bike fit. But in a professional bike fit analysis, then an expert would actually look at your position on the saddle as well. And if I go actually at the bottom of this report, you can see that there is a specific analysis of the saddle as well. So the bike fit expert actually used a methodology, which is called Retool, and they analyzed, you can see probably also from the pictures here on the right, they actually took some key parts of my body, specifically the shoulder, the elbow, the hip, the knee, and the ankle, these 5 points. And they actually could determine the pressure, the angles, also on the saddle. So the choice of the saddle is one of the most important ones, because obviously when you start riding more and more, you want to be comfortable on your bike. So it's not just about reaching the handlebar, it's not about the right position of your legs, but it's also like about your private parts sitting comfortably on the bike for hours and hours possibly. So one of the differences, for example, that most of the brands of bikes have between women-specific bikes and men-specific bikes is actually the saddle. And the inner bones of women tend to be slightly larger. And that's why the saddle on women-specific bikes tend to be wider than the men's one.
Yeah.
But this is something very individual. So again, the bike fit, a very good bike fit analysis will tell you about also your position on the saddle. So for example, in my specific case, I'm a bit right-handed, and on the bike, this is also being reflected by the fact that my right leg is a little bit more powerful than my left leg. As a result, I tend to put more pressure on the saddle on the right side. And in one of my bikes, I discovered at a certain point that the saddle was slightly tilting towards the right.
Yeah.
So long story short, there's actually no particular methodology about saddles, in the sense that it's a bit of trial and error methodology. So you try several saddles, and you find eventually the one that you find yourself most comfortable on. But again, first you need to make sure that the bike is the right fit and the right frame for you. and then you decide, you try maybe this. Obviously, the bike comes with a saddle, and you try the saddle, and you see if maybe the back. I don't have any backache. I don't have any problem. I don't have problems on my glutes, on my hips, on my knees. But maybe I have problems on the private parts, and that's specifically on the saddle. But I will start first with the right frame on the bike, and then you try to change the saddle if needed. But the saddle, again, the choice of the saddle goes after the choice of the frame, if it makes sense.
Is it complicated to measure yourself? I mean, yeah, I understand you recommend, asking an expert, but if you are okay.
No. If you, for example, you are on a budget and you still want to choose your first serious bike, but you don't have like maybe 200 euros or 200 pounds to go for a professional bike fit, well, I would suggest you can always ask your expert friends, but you can also use the methodology I was describing before. So once you have decided, you have measured your instep, for example, using the book against the wall, that it's very simple, it's very quick. Then having already an idea of how tall you are, but especially your instep, because again, we talked about the proportion of your body between the upper body and the lower body. So most of the people would say, oh, this is your bike, how tall you are? Oh, you are the same height. So possibly your bike is good for me. Be careful, because this is not, the height itself is just one part of the picture. But it depends really much on the proportion between your lower body, which will determine the stack of the frame, the right stack for you, and the upper body, which will determine the reach of the frame.
Yep.
So it's not just the height. So, but you can start again by measuring your instep, making sure that when, again, your legs are not totally straight and not totally bent when you reach the bottom. And again, make sure that the pedals are like at 3 and 9. So they are like level on the same horizontal axis. In that position, your leg should not be totally straight and shouldn't form like a 90 degrees angle either. So it should be like around 30, 40 degrees, as I mentioned before. And that's a very cheap and quick way to start thinking about, okay, this bike is fitting me or not.
That's good. Thank you very much, Alex. It was really a lot of information. We are at the top of the hour now, and that's very good. I
appreciate that. That there are lots of technical information as well. So obviously, feel free to reach out. And most of you, some of the people actually following the live also probably know how to get in touch directly with me. Otherwise, I'm sure that Clelia will share ways to actually get in touch. So feel free to ask your questions. We also have a dedicated Slack channel on our Best Alumni network, where I'm kind of responsible for talking about sports and cycling. So you can always join that and ask your questions there. And otherwise, just pick probably among your friends and contacts who seems the most knowledgeable person, and without necessarily going to a bike shop. And that's actually how you choose your first serious love. But again, don't forget that one of the most important things is actually deciding again what the main goal, and try to again stick to your budget, but then choosing the right bike for you. Don't be tempted to fool yourself and think, okay, any bike, more or less. Yeah, if it's like for 10-15 minutes a day, then I'm sure that you can use the public bike, you can use the mountain bike of your father, who is much taller or much shorter than you. You can use your grandma bike. Any bike would sort of do the trick. But when you want to start being a little bit more serious, you have to choose the right bike for you. And again, when I say the right bike, I'm referring to the right type, but I'm also referring to the right fit. So you want to make sure that you can spend possibly 3-4 hours in a row without getting particularly tired, or without getting any discomfort on the saddle as well.
Thank you, Alex. Was very
My
good.
pleasure.
Was a very good time with you. Thank you for your availability, and to the audience, subscribe to the channel for to stay tuned for our next interesting webinars. And see you next time.